Wow, I cannot believe how fast 100 days came and went. Last week's devlog premiered on day 98, and I thought, well, I'll spend the weekend polishing up some sounds and call it a demo. That did not happen. I took a hard look at my priorities on the day that devlog launched, and I thought about what I could do. Sure, I could get some sounds in there and that would be nice, but wouldn't it be much better if more people could play the game how they wanted to play it? Wouldn't it be so much better if there were controller support? After all, I was so close. Except for the ways in which I wasn't close at all. So let's talk about it. And by talk, I mean maybe it's gonna turn into like an unhinged rant. I'm Dryden Thomas, and I am developing Disinherited. It's a side-scrolling roguelike game where you throw, catch, and parry your way through Death's domain to slay the Grim Reaper and claim eternal life, all to spite your father who cut you out of his will. Now, I'm a console guy at heart. My first console was the original Game Boy, then I got the Game Boy Advance, eventually Nintendo 64, and then GameCube, and then eventually the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, and the Switch. Switch Lite, that is. Even when I play on PC, for most games I'd rather have a controller in my hands. And even more importantly, my husband does not play games with mouse and keyboard at all, so he hasn't even been able to play Disinherited yet. Now, Disinherited's controls were always designed with controller in mind, even though most of the implementation work since then has been going into mouse and keyboard. And that's because it's just a lot easier to focus your dev efforts on one thing. Let's take Samuel's throw, for example. When using the mouse, the cursor guides the direction of your throw by taking the difference in position between Samuel and the cursor and lobbing the projectile in that direction. On controller, we use the position of the right stick. Only that doesn't feel so good. When you release the right trigger, you throw, but your thumb still has to be holding the direction you want to throw in or it'll get messed up. When I was testing it, I was finding it much more natural to release them both at the same time, or even release the thumb and then release the trigger. And in both cases, the projectile would just sort of like fall to the ground. I got around this pretty simply. The aimer script now remembers the direction that you're aiming and only updates it to a new direction if the input is over a certain magnitude. Under the new system, when you release toward the center, it stops registering the change and sticks with the direction that you were last holding in. Nice! Now all of Samuel's controls feel great on the controller and we can move on to something else. Just one problem. Nobody's gonna know how to use the controls because the tutorial is all written for mouse and keyboard. Well, that's easy enough. We should just write some new lines of text for the controller and then swap it out based on whether a controller is active. Oh, but that's not good enough either? Why is that? Is it because the X button is in 3 different places on the 3 major platforms? I also happen to know that the platforms can be pretty strict about how button prompts are displayed, so I figured I might as well go the whole 9 yards and implement it all the way. I mean, I already have the Zelu button prompts images, which is one of the most generous gifts ever given to the indie game dev community. So how hard could it be? Well, as it turns out, it can still be very hard. Some of this is just skill issue for sure. This forced me to engage with Unity's new input system on a whole different level. But also, the system itself is kinda confusing. I mean, what's the difference between a player input, an input action map, an input action reference, an input binding, a binding path, an effective path? How do I get the different parts of a composite binding, like when you have WASD versus a control stick? Why do I have to drag these sprites into these fields so many times? Is this really the recommended way to handle this? I went through the darkness, and I'm better now. After 2 days, I had this. Please press F to applaud. Building upon this system, I also got button prompts into the tutorial dialogue, onto the items when you collect them, and even below Samuel when you aim. It turned out very few people figured out on their own that you can cancel the aiming with the bash button. Imagine that. A lot of times in the heat of battle, I need a little button prompting, even on games that I know really, really well. Understanding this system and having built these tools is also a really important prerequisite to control rebinding. So it was a very good use of time for me to go deep on this stuff. So that's it, right? Controller handled. No! Because now you have to make sure it all works with the user interface. Mouse and keyboard is like a user interface dream. Anything that you want to interact with, you can just move your mouse and click it. It's relatively simple to get whatever kind of responses that you want. With mouse and keyboard, you can go over here and mouse over your beads and your relics, and a little description box pops up and you can see what they do. With the controller, not so much. Whenever a menu opens, you have to tell it which selectable object to select first, and then you have to make sure everything is navigable in a way that makes sense and feels intuitive. The worst offender by far was the bead trader event. When you talked to him, he used to display all your beads like this, and then you could click the two that you wanted to give up in exchange for a random one that you already owned. This curvy shape, as it turns out, is just awful to navigate via controller. I basically decided to scrap it and start over. This new UI succeeds where the last one failed in a lot of different ways, in my opinion. For one thing, you can undo your choices. For another, it's clearly labeled what's happening and what choices you're making. Third, the code is considerably cleaner than the first one. And finally, it actually does what I set out to do. It works with a controller. You look at this and think, well, that's super simple. But in our day-to-day, we're so engaged with user interfaces all the time that when something works not like we expect it to, it's really jarring. Speaking of beads, I've done a little bit of remixing of the bead system. Hey, Editor Dryden here. My other editor, who I am married to, explained to me that I did not explain the bead system at all in this video, so here it is. You collect the beads along your run and you add them to your rosary, and they're like small stackable buffs to different stats. And you tend to collect a lot of them over the course of a run. The carnelian bead would increase your health by 10, and the ruby bead would increase your health by 20. The balance trade-off there was that the ruby bead was a lot rarer, but ultimately that creates a clear best bead. I compressed them both into just the ruby bead and made it worth 15 health instead. I also cut the pearl and the amethyst bead. Pearl bead increases your catch duration, and amethyst bead increases your throwing speed, neither of which I thought were all that impactful on the game. The amethyst color is unique though, and the emerald and nephrite beads were all too similar. So I replaced the emerald with the amethyst. Then I switched to the gilded bead so that it increases the drop rate of viatica, which is universally useful because it's what helps you buy relics and stuff. Gilded bead used to decrease your oil burn rate, and topaz bead would increase the amount of oil that you got. Ultimately, this is a little bit redundant since the result of both is having higher light on average. I kept the topaz because getting more of something is more fun than losing less of something. That leaves us with 10 types of beads, which I think is plenty. Every sort of theme of builds is covered without covering too much. Where the throw-catch theme used to have 4 beads representing it, now it only has 2. The most represented theme is mobility, with 3 beads covering it, but they're all very different. One buffs your move speed, one gives you more stamina, and one gives you air jumps. Speaking of mobility, I've been tweaking some things in Samuel's kit. I patched out the Endless Speed Zoomule after watching playtest Czar Dallas abuse it to absolutely obliterate Silas. Now you can jump out of Samuel's roll at any time. This has made the roll feel much easier to control and more versatile in my opinion. It also caused a couple other little problems, like this one that AJ Havoc pointed out, where you get to crawl in the ceiling, sort of. I also got into a touch of balancing. The Infinite Machine was a brutally difficult area, and it still is pretty hard, but there were 2 large reasons that it stood out from the rest. First, there are just a greater number of dangerous enemies. In the catacombs and the monastery, there are these spiders and these ghosts that spawn in the enemy spots. And those enemies are less dangerous and even give you resources. Second, there weren't any destructible boxes like in the catacombs and the monastery, and those serve as an important source of lantern oil. To solve these problems, I first added a slider on my end that adjusts the enemy spawn rate. As for destructibles, you can now break these light bulbs and get some light. I also got to do a little bit of beautification. I realized that my floating dust particles in the catacombs and monastery had gone missing, so I got them back. With a little touch of finessing and the help of my parallax shader, I was able to bring some of them into the foreground as well, so you get a little bit of extra depth out of it. I also went in and decorated a couple of the little zones that got missed. Also, a couple people suggested last week making the stamina meter blue, and I tried it and I liked it. Another contingency thought that it shouldn't flip with you, so I did that too. I'll probably also give you the option to turn it off in settings if you like that better. Oh, and in fun news, starting right now at the time of this upload, I'm joining the Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam with Ollie from Mashup Games. So I hope we get a good theme. Initially, I wanted to give you all the demo of Disinherited today, But since I'm going to be hyper-focused on the game jam all weekend, if something were to go wrong with the demo and it was broken, I wouldn't be able to divert my attention to fix it. Also, at the time of recording, my playtesters are still finding little issues here that I would really like to fix before it opens up to any kind of wider audience. So I'm gonna wait just a little bit longer. If you want to be one of the first to know about it, make sure that you join the Discord. And if you don't use that platform, visit disinheritedthegame.com and sign up for the email list, because I'll put it out via that too. It'll be the first email that I've sent from it. Next up, I'm gonna do a little retrospective devlog on this whole 100 days challenge thing. How it really felt, what I would have changed, what I wouldn't have changed, and also the future of Disinherited. Thank you so much to all of my channel members. You are the greatest. And a very special thank you to my Reaper Council level members, AJ Havoc, Ironic You Ask, and Red. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.